Ahoy Lorcana fans, Gibbles and Bits and Dead Broke Nerd here. Welcome back to the Camp Legend YouTube channel. Today we are going to run you through 4 interesting budget decks, all centered around the Amethyst ink color.
Yeah, we've got some cool stuff here. Gibby and I play a lot of Pixelborn, and everybody on Pixelborn has access to the entire card collection. But we also play a lot in person, and between building decks ourselves, opening packs, playing with what we pull and what we can trade for, as well as the fact that there's always new people coming to the hobby, teaching friends and family. There I feel like is a need for exploring what it takes to build a solid deck on a budget that you can walk up to, your local Lorcana League or open play night and not, completely embarrass yourself, right? Maybe it won't be the best deck maybe you won't win it, but you'll come in and you'll have a cool deck that functions, that you'll be able to play and enjoy that sort of in-person component of the game. So we have concocted decks all focused around the Amethyst color. If people like this, maybe we will try this with other ink types. But we focused each of these in these are all deck lists in Dreamborn. You can find the links down in the description, but we've basically taken the idea of like it's going to be less than $30 total for the whole deck. We have a $30 budget on the deck, and some of these things could be even cheaper, and we can talk through what makes them that way. But all of them are going to ideally be set up so that you can build them or trade for them relatively cheap and accumulate some of the cards that maybe wouldn't see play otherwise, but that are still solid cards in a bubble. So Gibby, why don't you kick us off with your Forces of Evil on a budget list?
Yeah, so this Forces of Evil on a budget list is an Amethyst and Amber combination deck, all centered around the villain keyword archetype. So it is a mid-range deck, I would say, almost into a control list, just because it does have some of the higher costed units. The goal of this deck here is to kind of play on curve, get a solid board state out, and go wide with your villains. The focal point of this deck is the 8-cost uninkable Hades, King of Olympus, where once you get him on board, he gains an additional lore on top of his one stated lore in his on his card printed for every other villain he's got on his side of the board as an ally. So the wider your board, the more he quests for. Towards the end of the game, he's a really good finisher. You've got some great units here, like the Dr. Facilier 2-drop that has +2 Challenger. So he's a 2-cost 2/4 essentially on your turn, can really take out some of the early game units. Something similar is the Jafar, Keeper of Secrets, at 4 cost. So you can use these high Challenger units, assuming that you've got a decent hand, which Amethyst does very well, to take out some of your opponent's board and continue to maintain your positive board state, getting you closer to dropping that big Hades down, which you can also shift in using Hades, Lord of the Underworld, one of my favorite cards that currently exists in the game. 4-drop Amber card that allows you to pull a card that's been destroyed back from your discard on into your hand to then drop later again on the board, continuing that big board state. So you've got some card draw here with friends on the other side, giving you 2 cards. Hades itself, being able to pull specific cards from your deck by singing Be Our Guest. So you've got ways to keep refilling your hand, make a big board state, and then quest high with all those villains.
Yeah, this is a really cool list. Gibby and I have both been humongous fans of Hades, King of Olympus. It's a really, really cool card that just inspires fun. And so of all these lists that we've put together for you, I think this is the one that just makes me smile the most because of, all of the fun, cool versions of these villains that we get to see and try out. Some cards worth mentioning, Gibby, I see you spent most of your budget on these 3 Yzmas, Scary Beyond All Reason. Can you tell me more about what this card does?
Yzma allows you to bounce either one of your units back to your deck that you've currently got on board to draw 2 cards, or deal with a pesky card on your opponent's board that might be hard to remove, maybe something with resist or another big unit, and they would draw 2 cards, but it does remove that unit off board and give you some tempo. So it's a very flexible card. You could easily, if you have them, replace Yzma with Ursula as another high-costed drop that will give you some cards in hand and also quest for a decent bit, but Yzma, a little bit more accessible, a little cheaper than Ursula right now, fitting kind of our budget motif. So yeah, Yzma's a really good card draw card. And a villain. So great card draw, removal, or and also quest for a decent amount.
Yeah, another thing that I think is really cool here is all of the villains. And when you look in here, there's only a few cards that aren't villains, like Pascal and Simba. If I'm looking at this right, those are the only two non-villains, right? So everything else, even the cheap ones, can come down once you have a big Hades out. And he shifts for 6. So you can actually get him down, on turn 6. And he's got huge stats. That's when I've played with Hades, I've been really impressed with how many times you can kind of take trades into things because he can clean up a board just as well as he can quest. And sometimes you need to clean up a board before you start questing for 3 or 4 or 5 a pop with Hades. So it's pretty cool.
Especially if you're shifting him, he can be impactful immediately. He can quest for that big amount immediately, or he can clear something and most likely live whatever challenge it is, even from something big like a Maui. So he's great in the late game, great to play on curve on that 6 if you can shift him in.
And Queen Commanding Presence has a fantastic combo with World's Greatest Criminal Mind. You don't have to give the +4 power to your own character. You can always give it to another player's character and then blow it up with World's Greatest Criminal Mind, which banishes something with 5 or more. So that's one of my favorite combos in the game right now. It's just so cheeky and people don't see it coming, even the people that know about it don't see it coming until it happens.
Yeah, the fact that the Queen is a villain, she's shiftable on 2 if you really can pull it off. If you get the 1-drop Queen, Regal Monarch into Queen, the 5-drop Queen for shifting her on 2. It's a really good early game board presence. It also helps keep your board alive, or like you said, World's Greatest Criminal Mind allows you to pull off some cheeky combos. So it's a great card that is a very high value card, but not as expensive because it did come in the starter deck for Rise of the Floodborn. So it came in one of those 2 decks. So that does tend to deflate the price on TCG Player on the average cost. So a little bit easier to come by.
Yeah, these cards are definitely, even though they're a little pricier, $184 right now is the market average, I guess. I don't know. I guess Gibby, you'd probably agree. Very worth picking up 4 copies.
Oh, yeah.
This is going to be meta for a long time.
I totally agree.
So awesome. Well, let's go ahead and move over to the next deck. This one's mine. So I have the Graveyard Shift, which admittedly was Gibby's name. I have to give him credit. He named it.
It's my specialty. The
he's good at the naming.
Have always been good for me.
He names the things well. So this is a Amethyst Steel deck. Now, I'm not sure how many folks watching this are just getting into the game, or some who might be watching it who are already really into the game like Gibby and I are. Amethyst Steel is an incredibly strong meta deck when fully blinged out, but it's very, very, very expensive to get all of those cards. It currently wants to run 4 copies of the most expensive non-enchanted card, which is, the Beast Tragic Hero Legendary, which is sitting at $40 a card right now.
It's 43 when I looked this morning.
It's not accessible at all.
No, and it's not. It's over our budget on 1 card.
Not even a little. So I went ahead and built a sort of budget approach to a mid-range style deck, calling it the Graveyard Shift, which is basically taking all of the expensive cards in the deck in the normal one and replacing them with less expensive cards that do similar things. And so we have the normal one will be running something like Big Cinderella. Here we're running Dr. Facilier Agent Provocateur, a card that costs literally nothing, 21 cents, but actually has a really cool effect. It quests for 3, so you can shift it in and quest for 3. And then, of course, whenever one of your characters is banished in a challenge, you get to return it to your hand. This deck wants to maintain a big, nice, juicy hand, all the way throughout the game. And the way it does that is by playing a ton of great shifting Floodborns. And so it is going to capitalize off of the Blue Fairy. Whenever you play a Floodborn, you can draw a card. And off of Chief Bogo, who, whenever you play a Floodborn character, does 1 damage to all opposing characters. And as you can see from here, we have a bunch of different Floodborn characters that we can play, like Jafar Dreadnought, Pinocchio, Captain Hook, Yzma. We've seen that one before.
Yes, we have.
Hercules, which, by the way, is one of my favorite cards from the set, despite sort of being, I think, a little bit underrated by the general community at large. Resist 2 is a fantastic, power to have, and the 6 attack kills pretty much everything in combat. And then, like I mentioned, Dr. Facilier. And then we've spent a little bit of our budget on 3 Grab Your Swords. You cannot do worse than picking up a few of these copies if you're just starting out the game. It is worth the price tag. They will be meta as long as they're allowed to be meta.
That's for sure. Yeah, something interesting about this deck that I think is worth highlighting is the combo that you've got here between Dr. Facilier, and you've really made a good focus to have a lot of on-play effects within this deck. So when you play something, you've got that big Dr. Facilier out, and something dies off of your board and would go to discard pile, but goes back to your hand, you're going to immediately be able to see impact by slamming that back on the board, whether it's drawing cards from Maleficent Sorceress and that 3-cost lot to make your hand even bigger, or if it's the two Pinocchios that you've got in here, both on
Love
inkable.
this card.
Yeah, Pinocchio is a talkative puppet. Being able to exert something as soon as it comes in is a fantastic ability that, for the price point of only 2 ink, that's a really good effect. It's just supposed to be that the fact that it's uninkable is kind of the downside to the card, but a card that I think you and I would both agree is rather unutilized with right now within a lot of Amethyst decks. Even the 5-cost Pinocchio you've got of On the Run,
Yeah.
great effect coming into the board when you hit it, of being able to recall something back to your opponent's hand. So it's a bunch of great cards in here that all synergize with both that Blue Fairy and Chief Bogo, because those shift targets are all Floodborn. So
Yeah.
you could definitely upgrade this deck if you ever wanted to, right? If you end up having some cards that you got lucky and pulled when you were store hunting within Steel or Amethyst that are some of the more, I don't know, high profile Tinkerbell, great giant fairies, or the Cinderella Stout Hearts. But I totally agree with you. Hercules Divine Hero is a fantastic shift target.
One thing I want to throw out there too, obviously we have all these shift cards, but you'll notice I'm not running the shift like Hercules. I'm not running the 2-drop Hercules to shift in. You could, but one of the things with a deck like this that draws so many cards is you don't necessarily have to have all of the early drop versions of your shift characters in order to play them. Some of these cards like Hercules, I don't mind just slamming for 6 on a turn when I don't need to do anything else. Like Gibby mentioned, there are a lot of cards that come in and do things like Pinocchio, like Yzma, right? And so if I'm taking a turn where my opponent didn't do anything that really threatens me, I'm going to use that turn to develop something that's more proactive. You know, slam that Hercules down, bring down a Jafar Dreadnought, things that are going to not necessarily do something right away, but force my opponent to play differently and react to what I've done. And so you'll see that I'm not running a cheap Hercules in here. But if you really wanted to, you totally could. Right now, I'm running some really cool things like Prince Eric and the low-cost Jafar, and Captain Hook as ways to disrupt enemy early games. Other aggro decks, this is sort of mid-range, where if you're playing against somebody that's playing a very aggressive style deck, you want to slow the game down. You want to just, banish their things and challenges as much as possible. You want to be utilizing Smash and Grab Your Swords and Pinocchio to defeat things before they quest, right? And similarly, we also have a really cool card, which I think is used to be played a little bit in the last set, the first chapter meta, and has fallen off, but in a budget format is actually pretty cool, which is the White Rabbit's Pocket Watch. Once you get this down, especially in a matchup that's a little bit slower against another mid-range deck or against a control deck, getting this down for 3, for the rest of the game, you can just spend 1 extra to give a character that you bring in Rush, which is really effective with all of these challenger units. Captain Hook has challenger. You've got Jafar and this other Jafar that want to take things on. Baby Jafar can fight evasives. Bigger Jafar, Dreadnought Jafar gets a card whenever he banishes somebody. You have a lot of things that really want to be engaging in combat, and this will help you do that in a way that will surprise your opponent. For 7, you can bring down an enormous Hercules and take out pretty much everything that they have and not take much damage back. So pretty cool stuff. I really like this deck as a starter. This would be like, if you got this as a starter deck, I mean, that's basically what this is at $25, right? Like, the Yzmas are really the only thing, and the Grab Your Swords jacking up the price. Like, this is highly accessible, and you can pull out wins with this deck against a lot of other things. So, obviously against control decks, you want to move fast and play a lot of your, 2 questers, right? Like Lawrence and stuff, but it's very modular. There's tons of cards that can go in here. Pretty much any of the Floodborns in these colors can go in. Your early game is pretty modular. You can run different songs or removal spells if you want. But this general format of playing around the, shift targets, I think is a pretty strong budget archetype. So
absolutely.
Shall we move over to your next deck, Gibby? We've got 4 decks for y'all today.
Yeah, let's do it.
What do we got
All right.
here?
So this is my second deck. This is going to be an Amethyst and Ruby deck called White Glove Slap. Now, this is a play on the old-timey a way that you would challenge somebody to a duel. You would slap them with a white glove, and this deck is all focuses around challenges. So it utilizes a lot of the new Floodborn package that we see in Amethyst between the battle between Merlin and Madam Mim. So if you did pick up one of the starter decks that does have a lot of the Madam Mim Merlin package, you will have access to a lot of these cards already, which helps with the budget piece of things. But it's all focused around gaining lore incrementally as you make challenges. So you've got the Madam Mim Snake, the Madam Mim Fox, the Merlin Crab. All of these tools not only allow you to recall a unit if they're damaged to get them back to full health within your hand, but they're all great at challenging. Madam Mim Fox, while they only have 1 copy in here, you do get 1 copy in the starter deck, so that's why I wanted to highlight only running 1 copy in here. You can always add more of this card if you do have them, because Madam Mim Fox is great. She's got Rush and she comes down with a 3-cost unit, allowing you to challenge something immediately. Probably the centerpiece of this deck is the Shere Khan Menacing Predator, 3-cost from Ruby. What this does is every single time you challenge a character, you gain a lore, regardless of the outcome of the challenge, who dies, who doesn't. If both characters live, whatever happens, you gain a lore from it as long as Shere Khan is on the board. Same thing with the Aladdin package of Aladdin Street Rat, 3-cost unit. When you play the small Aladdin, your opponent automatically loses a lore, and you can shift in Aladdin Heroic Outlaw, which I know you're a card you're very high on, at 7 cost, but you can shift him in for 5, where anytime you kill you banish an opponent's unit in a challenge, you then gain 2 lore and they gain 2 lore. So this deck does a very good job.
Well, they lose 2 lore. We steal 2 lore.
You steal 2 lore from them, so you gain 2 lore and they lose 2 lore. So you are slowing down your opponent while also incrementally challenging. If you have Aladdin and Shere Khan out and you kill something, you've just gained 3 lore, 1 from Shere Khan and 2 from Aladdin. So you are incrementally trying to get your lore back or increase your lore count to 20 from these challenges. We are also running the Doctor's Facilier Agent Provocateur, similar to your previous deck, because bouncing units back to your hand and continuing to roll them out is great, especially when you're challenging. You've got Rafiki Mysterious Sage to help clear some quick units off of the board with those rush effects. And Dragonfire. We're running 4 copies of Dragonfire here, which is a cheap but effective removal tool from Ruby for any pesky big units that you don't think that you'll be able to clear with a challenge.
Yeah, very nice. One of the things that's really cool about this is it's a nice starting point for new players to upgrade the starter deck. So if they got the Mim and Merlin starter deck, they'll be able to take that baseline and just add some red cards. It's crazy. This Aladdin is a solid card that is maybe not dominant in the meta, but can repeatedly shows up from time to time in high performing lists. It is one of the most ultimate anti-aggro tools. If you can manage to get this shifted in on turn 5 or 6 before aggro wins the game, you basically completely flip it back in your favor in one fell swoop. So really, really strong card and really cheap for what it does. 46 cents a pop. You can probably find people at your local store that are just trying to give them away. I know I've pulled just so many Aladdins, just so many. I literally donated a full playset to my dad the other day because I'm like, I don't need any more of this.
Right.
But it's so good. It's not a reflection on the power of the card. Same with Queen of Hearts, for an uncommon. This is one of the best uncommon cards in the game now, especially for Ruby getting finally some card draw of its own instead of having to go to other factions to draw. I did want to ask, one of the things that's interesting is you've put 2 freezes in each of your lists. I put the Pinocchios in. Is Pinocchio just a better freeze, or is there a reason why you like freeze better?
You can totally use freeze, or you can use the Pinocchios. I put freezes in here just as more of a spell kind of version of the card, but with the recursion that you're using off of Dr. Facilier, I would not have any problem utilizing the Pinocchios instead of the freezes, as still at that 2-cost ink unit. Is a unit instead of an action. You could totally use those as well. I think something that you and I are both trying to create here by putting Freeze or Pinocchio in these decks is the ability to have agency in choosing when you challenge and who you challenge.
Important.
So there are a lot of units that, as long as they don't have something like a ward on them where you can target them with units or target them with spells, you can pretty much choose who you want to remove when, even if your opponent decides they are not going to quest or challenge with them that turn. So being able to force your opponent's hand to allow you to challenge, to gain lore off of Shere Khan or cards off of Queen of Hearts is a really good thing to be able to force out of your opponent in the mid to late game as well.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really cool deck, man. You know, it's also neat to see the Hey Hey slipping in as a nice budget option. The Merlin Crabs are really nice with Hey Hey as well. If you can put Hey Hey down on 2, follow up with the Crab. I've been worked by that play a few times. Actually, I remember that's one of my that was my only loss in the draft event that we did, was to a deck that managed to get a Hey Hey loop going and was just buffing it with a bunch of other things. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, and Merlin Goat, one of the premier late game options for control decks trying to gain lore through not necessarily a high lore unit, but every time you slap Merlin Goat down, he gains a lore. Every time he dies, he gains a lore, especially if you're pulling him back to your hand with other units, wherever he leaves board. Even if you pull him back by a recall off of another Madam Mim unit or something like that, he still gains that lore. It's when he leaves board. So, or if he comes back off of Dr. Facilier, you're getting incremental lore through challenges or by just him leaving the board and forcing your opponent's hand to challenge into him.
And, you know, there's a lot of ways this can be upgraded. Obviously, for those who have played the game for a long time and are watching this, you know, Ruby and Amethyst is probably the strongest deck, or one of the strongest decks in the entire format, and has been for a while. Kind of the boogeyman that forces everyone else to adapt, at least, right? And so this is not close to that deck, because that deck has a lot of very expensive late game cards, whereas this is playing more for the mid range. But there are some cards that you can pick up that will help this deck in the short term, and then also, you know, boost the power of your eventual rise towards the meta list over time. I think obviously adding more Mim Foxes, Merlin Rabbit. You might even get one of those in the starter deck. I can't remember.
You do. I think you do get one of them in the starter deck, and you could totally add Merlin Rabbit in here if you are feeling like, I think it's just over $1 or $1.20 or so right now.
Yeah.
If you're feeling like you need more card draw and you're running out of card draw, Merlin Rabbit gives you a card when he comes in, and then when he leaves play, you also draw another card. So a little understated, and I think uninkable, but it does give you some good.
Yeah,
it does give you some good card draw.
There's a lot of ways you can upgrade this. Oh, Maui, that's a great one.
Yeah, Maui's a 5-cost unit with Rush, big stat line to him too,
and
would
inkable.
allow you. Yeah, and inkable, that would allow you to challenge immediately on slamming down on the board, get off whatever effects you've got if you've got a Queen of Hearts or Shere Khan out. And if he dies taking out something big and you've got a Dr. Facilier, comes right back to your hand and you threaten it again.
Yeah.
So
fantastic.
A lot of challenger tricks you can play.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and move over to the last deck for the video. So this is my list. Gibby, again, helped me name it. It's Surprise Party. So I just want to start by saying this deck is really, really good. And I currently play, in my rotation of decks that I play seriously, I play a version of this myself. And you can see the total price of it at $15. That's the cheapest of all the decks we put together here. And I am not being facetious. I genuinely think this deck is fantastic, despite it being so cheap. My personal list is only 3 cards off of this. And those 3 cards still take it up to $30 and keep us within our limits. But I wanted to omit them only for the reason of showing you just how affordable this deck is. And so this is a pretty basic aggro deck, right? You are playing things from the jump that are trying to get on the board, quest, and be hard to take out without cost. So you can see we have 6 1-drops, a few less for what it's worth than most aggro decks, but I have found what is more important is the mid game of this deck as opposed to just jamming 1-drops. You kind of want to curve this deck out and not just flood the board. And so we have 4 Pascals, which is the best 1-drop you want to see on turn 1. because it gets evasive if you have another character. And we have 2 Olaf to sort of backfill our consistency of at least hitting something on one. And from there, we basically play as many disruptive questing cards as possible. Enchantress quests for 2, but has 3 power when being challenged, so there's very few 1 or 2 drops that can survive a fight with her. Flynn Rider, 2 quests for 2, and your opponent has to discard a card if they decide to challenge it. We have the Cheshire Cat. When somebody challenges and banishes it, they die as well, and it quests for 2. You can see what we're doing here, which is basically creating, and then we have in the late game things like Tinkerbell. We have Ray, 2 evasive cards. We have Genie, also evasive, and it's got another great effect I'll break down in a second. And Mad Hatter, all things that quest for a ton and are difficult to interact with, or if you do challenge them, they have an ancillary benefit for you. So really, really powerful cards that are all dedicated towards questing. And here's the kicker, this isn't all in on going as fast as possible, because there are other aggro decks in the format that go even faster. And it really sucks to play against those decks with an aggro deck and be like, I just can't keep up. This is a non-game. So this deck has been adjusted to be able to compete with some of the fastest decks in the format through disruptive cards like Rafiki, which has Rush, Zeus, which has Rush, as well as Genie on the Job to bounce things back to their hand, Mother Knows Best, which you can sing with something like a Maleficent. Maleficent only quests for 1. It's a great option to be able to sing both Friends on the Other Side and Mother Knows Best, because you're only missing out on 1 point for that turn. And perhaps most importantly, against things like hyper aggro, the bounce strategies that are going really, really, really fast, Jasper being able to say, yeah, you're 3
Absolutely.
lore questing Pinocchio, you can't quest with it next turn. It's really, really strong. Now, the only downside is it does get taken out by a Mim Fox with 4 defense. But I think that it's fair to say even just stopping 1 Pinocchio from questing is more than worth the cost that you get. And if you can get a second use of his puppy napping ability off, you're in a great, great spot. So I showed you all this so that I could tell you that the only things that make this better, in my personal opinion, having tested this deck a lot, are 3 John Silvers. And in order to play them, I would cut the 2 Donald Ducks, which I have in here as just an additional card draw package. If you top deck this in the mid to late game, like you're like, okay, great, I'm going to play it and keep drawing cards, keep fueling my aggro plays. And if you draw it early, you just ink it. I would cut 2 of these, and I'd cut 1 of these Cheshire Cats, and I'd put in 3 John Silvers. And you're talking about a deck that can win a bunch of different ways.
Yeah, this is a very flexible deck. One of the things I love that you've done here is you've kept your removal package, your bounce, essentially your action-based bounce package. You kept it very cheap, because into the mid game, what you're allowing yourself to do is develop further on your board, even if with a cheap unit, and combo that with a piece of removal. You and I both know that oftentimes when you've got 2 aggro decks, or even an aggro deck versus a mid-range deck, it comes down to a matter of 1 to 2 points worth of lore. The game can easily end 18 to 20 or 19 to 20 as you're doing the math getting out there. So being able to befuddle something back to your opponent's hand while developing another Pascal or a Flynn Rider on the board, it can make the difference between a win or a loss, especially if you're going first, second. So this deck is low to the ground. Mm-hmm. It is hard to compete with, hard to touch, because either you're disrupting your opponent's game plan, making them discard cards or remove units from the board to slow you down, or you're slowing them down just enough to where they still don't want to touch you, but they can't compete with you on the lore race. So totally love this deck. I think some of your rush units that you've got in here with Zeus and Rafiki are fantastic for slowing you down. Rafiki and Zeus, two of the best things about them is that 3 defense and that 4 defense, they are most likely going to live whatever challenge they come down with in rush, and gives you the ability to kind of suss that out and take out an aggressive unit or something else that might kill in return a unit that you really want to quest with. So
exactly,
a lot of disruption in here for your opponent's game plan. This is a combo killer, if I had to label it as anything, because
that too.
Your opponent cannot allow you to continue to outrace them and develop their combos. They have to use some of their combo pieces to kill you.
Well, and even if they
don't have it.
And even if they have a turn which is really efficient where they do some sort of ramping or some sort of combo setup, but then also spend a little bit of time on removal, you then can bounce whatever character they just dropped to set up their combo or to set up a ramping strategy or something. You can just immediately bounce it back with Mother Knows Best or a Befuddle or a Genie and say you tried to have the best of both worlds and now you have neither.
Yeah,
So
a lot of removal currently in the meta is we'll say Storm Rage on, Teeth and Ambitions. There's a lot of two. Yeah, I was like, and you'll notice. Grab your swords. 2, fire the cannons. 2. The only thing that really does 3 points of damage off of a spell is Smash, and that makes Ray really sticky as an evasive unit. That makes Tinkerbell really sticky as an evasive unit. That makes Donald Duck really sticky as a card draw piece for you. That makes
pretty
Genie
much everything
really sticky.
Everything after turn 3.
Yes, and I think that's a great place to aim to have a "Don't Touch Me" package, what I like to call the evasive and mid to late game of use. Don't Touch Me package.
Yeah.
So you've got a very sticky late game, mid to late game that will allow you to quest for a lot, despite it not looking like they are very high statted units.
Yeah. Well, those are our 4 budget decks for Amethyst. If you like this video, let us know in the comments if you want to see a certain color combination for us to take on next for our sort of our budget approaches for the Rise of the Floodborn meta. Feel free to drop that in, and if you try out some of the decks and you have ideas for ways to improve them, or if you have success with them, or any questions, of course, let us know, and feel free to join the Camp Legend Discord as well, and you can interact with us directly there, ask questions, throw out some ideas of your own. We'd be happy to see them. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.